There will be a moment, sometimes years into loving a narcissist, when the empath sitting across from them, someone who used to be so certain of who they were, so grounded in their own capacity for love, so full of instinct they trusted without question, finally looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the person looking back, not because that person disappeared overnight, because they were dismantled, piece by piece, so slowly, so methodically, that the empath never even felt the individual moments where the erosion happened. They just woke up one day and realized how much of themselves was gone. If you've ever wondered how someone so genuinely kind, so perceptive, so full of love could end up feeling this hollowed out, this uncertain of their own mind, today we're breaking down exactly how this happens, and more importantly, why it works so reliably on exactly the people who least deserve it. Here's what almost nobody explains clearly about narcissists and empaths, and I want you to really sit with this because it's the foundation for everything we're going to walk through today. This isn't a story about a bad match, two incompatible people who simply didn't understand each other. It's closer to something you'd describe in a predator and prey relationship, not because empaths are weak, but because the very qualities that make empaths extraordinary, their depth, their intuition, their capacity for connection, are the exact qualities a narcissist has learned, often unconsciously, to specifically target and exploit. Understanding this mechanism isn't about assigning blame to the empath for being too trusting or too kind. It's about finally seeing clearly how a very specific, very effective process works, so that it stops feeling like an unsolvable mystery and starts feeling like something you can recognize, interrupt, and heal from. So let's walk through exactly how this breaking process unfolds, because it happens in distinct, identifiable stages, and once you can see the architecture clearly, you'll understand not just what happened to you, but why it worked as effectively as it did. The first stage is what I'd call the mirroring seduction. This is where the narcissist doesn't actually reveal who they are. Instead, they reflect back exactly who the empath needs them to be. Because here's something crucial to understand about how narcissists initially approach a connection with someone deeply empathetic. They study, often without conscious awareness of doing so, exactly what this person values, what they're missing, what they've always hoped to find in a partner or friend. And then they become that thing, seamlessly, convincingly, almost supernaturally well. If the empath values deep emotional conversation, suddenly the narcissist is the most emotionally articulate person they've ever met. If the empath has always longed for someone who truly understands their inner world, suddenly the narcissist seems to understand it better than anyone ever has, finishing thoughts, anticipating needs, creating an experience of being seen so completely that it feels almost impossible, almost too good to be real. And this is exactly the point. It is too good to be real, because it isn't actually connection in the way the empath understands connection. It's calibration, a performance built specifically around the empath's own deepest hopes, reflected back with enough precision to bypass every normal defense mechanism a person would otherwise use to protect themselves from moving this fast, trusting this completely, this early. This stage works so effectively on empaths specifically because empaths, more than most people, are wired to believe in the possibility of deep, immediate connection. Their own capacity to feel things fully, to connect quickly and authentically, makes it genuinely difficult for them to imagine that someone else's apparent depth might be manufactured rather than real, because manufacturing that level of apparent understanding is simply not something an empath's own psychology would ever consider doing to another person. They extend the same authenticity they bring to every interaction, assuming reasonably from their own frame of reference that the person mirroring them this intensely must be feeling something equally real. The second stage is what I'd call the slow recalibration of normal. Once the initial mirroring has created deep trust and emotional investment, the narcissist begins introducing small inconsistencies, subtle enough that any single instance seems explainable, forgivable, even understandable given context. A promise that doesn't quite get kept, followed by a reasonable-sounding explanation. A comment that stings slightly, delivered with just enough humor or affection wrapped around it that objecting feels like overreacting. A boundary tested gently, then apologized for, then tested again slightly further the next time. Individually, none of these moments feel significant enough to justify alarm, and this is exactly the mechanism that makes this stage so effective. Because empaths are, almost by definition, people who extend generous interpretation to others, who look for the reasonable explanation before assuming bad intent, who would rather examine their own possible overreaction than immediately label someone else's behavior as a red flag. Each small inconsistency gets absorbed, explained away, folded into an evolving, expanding definition of what's normal and acceptable within this specific relationship, until the empath, without ever making a single conscious decision to lower their standards, finds themselves tolerating things that would have seemed completely unacceptable at the very beginning of the relationship. The third stage is what I'd call strategic doubt seeding, and this is where the process starts to become genuinely disorienting, because it specifically targets the empath's relationship with their own perception rather than just their tolerance for bad behavior. This is where contradictions start appearing not just in behavior, but in narrative, where something the empath clearly remembers happening gets denied, reframed, or subtly rewritten, just often enough, just consistently enough, that the empath starts to genuinely question their own memory, their own judgment, their own ability to accurately perceive what's happening in their own relationship. This might look like a conversation being flatly denied that definitely happened. It might look like an emotional reaction being labeled as disproportionate or irrational, until the empath starts preemptively doubting their own emotional responses before they even fully register them. It might look like consistent, subtle suggestions that the empath is too sensitive, too much, reading into things, language specifically designed to make the empath distrust the very intuition that used to be one of their greatest strengths. This stage is particularly devastating for empaths, specifically because their intuition, their gut sense of when something feels wrong, has typically been one of the most reliable tools they've used throughout their entire life to navigate relationships and protect themselves from harm. Once that intuition itself becomes a target, once the empath starts doubting not just individual situations, but their entire capacity to accurately perceive reality, the very tool that would normally alert them to danger stops functioning the way it's supposed to. This is precisely why so many empaths, people who are otherwise remarkably perceptive, remarkably attuned to nuance and dishonesty in other areas of their life, find themselves unable to see clearly what's happening in this specific relationship, not because their perceptive abilities have disappeared, but because those abilities have been specifically, systematically undermined at their source. The fourth stage is what I'd call the reorganization of identity around service. By this point, the empath's own needs, own boundaries, own sense of self have become so entangled with managing the narcissist's moods, meeting their expectations, and avoiding the withdrawal of affection that used to feel so devastating, that the empath's entire identity starts reorganizing itself around this singular function. Their days start shaping themselves around anticipating what the narcissist needs. Their own interests, friendships, and ambitions start quietly shrinking, not through any dramatic sacrifice, but through 1,000 small choices to prioritize the relationship's stability over their own growth. Because the cost of not prioritizing it, the coldness, the punishment, the withdrawal, has become too painful to risk triggering. This is one of the most tragic parts of this entire process, because the same generous, giving nature that made the empath so extraordinary in the first place becomes the exact mechanism through which their own identity gets slowly, methodically consumed. And this brings us to something crucial to understand about why this entire four-stage process works so consistently, so reliably, across so many different empaths, in so many different relationships, something that goes beyond any single tactic and explains the deeper mechanism tying every stage together, a mechanism that reveals something important, not just about narcissists, but about what specifically makes an empath so uniquely vulnerable to this exact kind of erosion in the first place. That's exactly where we're going next. The deeper mechanism, the one tying together the mirroring seduction, the slow recalibration of normal, the strategic doubt seeding, and the reorganization of identity around service, comes down to something specific about how empathy itself functions neurologically and psychologically. Something that explains why this exact combination of traits makes someone so uniquely vulnerable to this exact kind of erosion. Empaths, by nature, process other people's emotional states as though they were partially their own. This isn't a metaphor. It's closer to a literal description of how their nervous system operates, picking up on subtle emotional cues, absorbing atmosphere, feeling genuinely moved by another person's internal experience in a way that goes beyond simple observation. This capacity is extraordinary, and it's responsible for some of the deepest, most meaningful connections a person can experience in their life. But it also means that an empath's own emotional regulation becomes, to some degree, entangled with the emotional state of whoever they're closest to. When that person is healthy, this entanglement enriches both people. When that person is a narcissist, whose emotional states shift rapidly, whose moods are used strategically to control the emotional temperature of the relationship, that same entanglement becomes a direct channel through which the empath's own sense of stability gets hijacked, moment to moment, by someone else's manufactured emotional weather. This is the core reason the 4 stages we walked through work as effectively as they do, and specifically why they work so much better on empaths than on people whose emotional processing operates differently. The mirroring seduction lands so deeply because an empath's own capacity for genuine connection makes it almost impossible for them to imagine that level of apparent understanding could be manufactured rather than felt. The slow recalibration of normal succeeds because an empath's instinct is always to extend generous interpretation first, to examine their own possible overreaction before assuming someone else's bad intent. The strategic doubt seeding is so devastating specifically because it targets the exact tool, intuition, that empaths have spent their whole life trusting and relying on more than most people ever learn to. And the reorganization of identity around service happens so completely because an empath's sense of purpose has often always been at least partially rooted in caring for others, which makes the slow narrowing of their world around one person's needs feel, disturbingly, like an extension of who they already were, rather than a warning sign of who they were becoming. Now, I want to address something important here, because understanding this mechanism can easily tip into a narrative that feels almost fatalistic, like empathy itself is the problem. Like the very trait that makes you capable of deep love is also what makes you perpetually vulnerable to this exact kind of exploitation. I want to push back on that firmly because it isn't the full picture, and it leaves out something crucial. Empathy isn't the vulnerability. Unprotected empathy is. There's a real, meaningful difference between an empath who has learned to pair their emotional depth with strong internal boundaries, discernment, and a stable sense of self that doesn't depend on another person's approval to feel secure, and an empath who hasn't yet developed those protective structures alongside their natural sensitivity. The goal was never to become less empathetic, less caring, less capable of deep connection. The goal is to develop the internal architecture that allows that empathy to coexist with genuine self-protection, so that depth of feeling for another person never again comes at the total expense of your own reality, your own boundaries, your own sense of who you are. So what does that protective architecture actually look like in practice? And how does someone who's already been through this process, someone who's already experienced their identity reorganized around someone else's needs, start rebuilding it? It starts with something that sounds simple but requires genuine, repeated practice. Learning to notice the exact moment your own perception starts to waver in the face of someone else's confident denial. and instead of immediately assuming you must be wrong, pausing long enough to check that perception against something outside the relationship itself, a trusted friend, a written record, your own past journal entries, anything that exists independently of the person whose narrative has so much power to reshape your memory in real time. This single practice, checking your perception against something external rather than immediately deferring to the more confident voice in the room, is one of the most powerful tools available for interrupting strategic doubt seeding before it fully takes hold. It also means learning to treat small inconsistencies as data rather than explaining them away individually. This doesn't mean becoming suspicious or guarded with everyone, which would undermine the very capacity for connection that makes you who you are. It means developing the discipline to notice patterns over time rather than evaluating each incident in isolation, asking not just, can I understand why this one thing happened, but how many times has something like this happened now, and what does that pattern actually tell me? Narcissists depend on each individual incident being evaluated on its own, disconnected from everything that came before it, because in isolation, almost anything can be explained away. It's only when you allow yourself to see the pattern as a whole that the actual shape of what's happening becomes impossible to rationalize any further. And it means, perhaps most importantly, learning to notice the exact moment your own needs, interests, and identity start quietly reorganizing around someone else's expectations, and treating that reorganization as information worth taking seriously rather than simply evidence of how much you love someone. Real love, healthy love, does involve compromise, does involve genuinely caring about another person's needs and preferences. But there's a critical difference between mutual compromise, where both people's identities remain essentially intact while flexing toward each other, and one-directional erosion, where one person's entire sense of self gradually gets absorbed into managing another person's emotional stability. Learning to feel the difference between those two experiences in your body, not just intellectually, is one of the most protective skills an empath can develop. I want to leave you with something today that I think matters more than almost anything else in this entire conversation. If you recognize yourself in every stage we've walked through today, the mirroring, the slow recalibration, the doubt seeding, the reorganization of identity, I want you to understand that what happened to you wasn't a failure of intelligence, wasn't evidence of weakness, wasn't proof that you're somehow more gullible or less discerning than other people. It happened because you have a genuine, extraordinary capacity for connection, and that capacity was specifically, deliberately targeted by someone who had learned, through years of practice, exactly how to exploit it. The fact that it worked on you doesn't say anything about a flaw in who you are. It says something about how sophisticated and specifically calibrated this process actually is, sophisticated enough to work on some of the most perceptive, caring, emotionally intelligent people in the world. And the same depth that made you vulnerable to this exact process is still there, fully intact, fully capable of being protected properly this time, and fully capable of eventually being offered again to someone who will actually deserve the extraordinary thing you have to give. If this helped explain something about your own experience that's felt confusing or even shameful for a long time, know that you're far from the only empath who's lived through this exact process, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed, because we go deeper into this every single week.